They dressed the ballroom in gold and roses. Yet my mother and sister marched me past every shining table and dropped me in a broken chair by the kitchen doors, where the smell of grease clung to my dress, and guests whispered with laughter. I felt their eyes burn into me as Victoria leaned close, her smile sharp, hissing that this was the seat I deserved. My chest ached. My palms trembled against my knees, but instead of crying, I reached for my phone, opened the one thread that mattered, and whispered through shaking fingers to the man no one here knew was mine, a billionaire who had once promised he would never let me be buried in shame. The music was already swelling through the grand ballroom when I stepped inside, heels clicking against the polished marble floor. My brother Daniel's wedding was the kind of event people in Austin whispered about for weeks, held at the most extravagant downtown hotel with chandeliers dripping crystal and tables dressed in ivory linens. I had chosen my dress carefully, a deep green silk that I bought with my own paycheck. It was the kind of dress that made me feel like I belonged, even if my family never thought so. For a moment I allowed myself to take it in, the flowers arranged in perfect arcs, the laughter rolling across the room, the flashes from photographers catching every smile. But then, I spotted my mother Elaine, lips pursed tight as always, and my sister Victoria, radiant in a burgundy gown she had probably borrowed from one of her rich friends. They beckoned me over with that familiar air of control, as if I were still the awkward little sister who needed direction. Victoria leaned close, her perfume heavy, her smile sharp. She placed a hand on my back and steered me across the room. My mother followed, her eyes scanning the crowd, as if making sure people saw us together. I expected to be seated somewhere with cousins, maybe even near family friends. But as we moved past table after table, each set near the stage or the dance floor, my stomach began to sink. Finally, we reached a corner where the music was muffled by swinging kitchen doors. The table was small, its cloth slightly wrinkled, the chairs plain banquet seats that did not match the gold Chiavari chairs around the room. The smell of roasted meat and dishwater wafted out every time the servers pushed through the doors behind me. Victoria gestured toward the chair. "Sit here, Maddie." I froze. Heat rushed up my neck. Guests at the nearby tables turned their heads, and I could feel their eyes on me, questioning, amused. My mother gave a brisk nod, as if this were the most natural choice. "Here," I whispered, my throat dry. "Yes, here." My mother's voice carried that tone that tolerated no argument. "You will have a good view." Of the kitchen, I thought bitterly. I lowered myself onto the chair, smoothing my dress over my knees. The laughter at the next table seemed louder now, each clink of champagne glasses reminding me of where I was not welcome. I could see Daniel and his bride beaming at the head table photographers, crowding around family members glowing in the spotlight. And here I was, tucked away by the swinging doors, like an afterthought. A group of teenagers walked past one of them, whispering something that made the others laugh as they glanced at me. My cheeks burned. I picked up the water glass in front of me, only half filled and smudged, and took a sip to steady my shaking hands. Victoria leaned down again, her smile like a knife. "This is fitting, isn't it? You always liked being near the action." She left me with that, gliding away toward her seat near the front, where her laughter blended seamlessly with the glitter of the crowd. I pressed my palms into my lap, willing myself not to cry. Not here. Not where they wanted me to break. The waiters rushed through the doors behind me, trays clattering, steam rising. Every time the door swung open, I caught another burst of kitchen chatter, the clash of pots, the sizzling of meat. I tried to straighten my back to pretend I did not care, but my chest ached. Memories of every time my family had pushed me aside came flooding back, and tonight it was more public than ever. I glanced at my phone on the table. For a few minutes I told myself to leave it alone, to swallow this humiliation, like all the others. But the weight of it pressed down harder with each passing second until I could not breathe. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen. The bright glow illuminated my face, a small shield against the shadows. I opened the thread that mattered, the one name that made me feel safe. Nathaniel. My fingers flew before I could stop them. Emotions poured into words. I cannot take this anymore. I set the phone down, pulse pounding in my ears, the ballroom spinning with laughter and music that no longer sounded sweet. I closed my eyes and exhaled, waiting for the reply, waiting for something that would remind me I was not invisible, not worthless, not just a girl shoved to the edge of her own brother's celebration. The clamor of the kitchen doors behind me pulled me back to an older noise, the echo of my father's voice in our house on the east side of Austin. Richard Carter never needed to raise his volume too high to make the whole house bend to him. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed his word was law, and we all grew up learning that his approval was the rarest currency. But in truth, it was my mother Elaine's favoritism that cut the deepest. I can still see the scene around the dining table when I was 12. Victoria came home with a report card, littered with B's and a single A in history. Mother beamed as if she had been handed the key to Harvard. She clapped her hands, hugging Victoria, telling her how proud she was. When I slid my own paper across the table showing straight A's and the small stamp that marked me for academic honors, she barely glanced at it before saying that grades were not everything. The sting of her dismissal burned worse than any punishment. Daniel always had a different kind of glow around him. He was the boy who carried my father's hopes, the golden child who could do no wrong. I remember the day he was offered a job at a local construction company right after high school. My father opened a bottle of wine to celebrate, praising Daniel's work ethic and determination. I had just been notified of a scholarship for a summer science program in Houston, something I had worked toward for years. My news was met with a nod, nothing more. In that moment, I understood where the lines in our family had been drawn. There were countless small humiliations, stacked one on another. Victoria was allowed to drive Mother's car before she even had a license, while I rode the city bus with my books pressed to my chest. Daniel got the newest sneakers, a symbol of pride on the football field, while I wore hand-me-downs from neighbors. Father said life was not about fairness, that it built character, but the lesson I absorbed was simpler. In our home, love and approval were rationed, and I was always last in line. The only person who seemed to see me was my grandmother Rose. She lived in a modest brick house just 2 streets away. Her backyard filled with roses and herbs she tended carefully, even in the brutal Texas heat. I would spend afternoons there curled up at her kitchen table while she brewed sweet tea and listened without interruption. She had a way of looking at me as though my words were worth something, as though my thoughts mattered. One evening when I was 15, after another argument at home where my father barked at me for being too opinionated, I found myself crying in her living room. She pulled me close and whispered, "Never let anyone decide your worth, Maddie. Not your father, not your mother, not anyone. Only you can write that." She pressed a folded 20 into my palm, not because I needed it, but to remind me that she believed I could one day leave and stand on my own. I carried that bill in my wallet for years, long after the ink had faded and the paper had worn thin. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small room, listening to the muffled laughter of Victoria on the phone, or the sound of Daniel coming home late after practice, and I vowed I would not be trapped in that house forever. I would not stay in Austin just to be the invisible child at every family dinner. The city lights outside my window seemed to whisper promises of escape, and I clung to them as tightly as I clung to my textbooks. The memory of that vow hovered now as I sat in the ballroom, the air heavy with perfume and champagne. The same ache that had filled me as a girl pressed against my ribs. No matter how many degrees I earned or promotions I secured, I remained the outsider in my own family, the one they could humiliate without hesitation. I drew in a breath, steadying myself, and let the images of my grandmother's garden fill my mind, her voice soft against the roar of the reception. A waiter brushed past me with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, apologizing quickly before rushing into the kitchen. I stared down at my phone, the screen still blank of any reply. My chest tightened with both shame and anticipation, my hands folding tightly in my lap. The laughter from the tables nearby rolled over me again, bright and cruel. I remembered the last words I whispered to myself before leaving my grandmother's porch for college, the night she told me I was destined for more. "I will leave. I promised then. I will not stay here, not in the shadow of their favoritism." I thought of that vow, now repeating it silently in the dim light by the kitchen doors, as the celebration roared on without me. The phone buzzed softly in my hand, pulling me from the echo of that promise. I drew a sharp breath, heart racing, bracing for the words that would either steady me or break me further. The message on the screen was only a few words, but it steadied me in a way nothing else could have. I slipped the phone back into my purse and let my mind drift to the dinner. We had a week before the one where everything about my sister seemed to shine in my parents' eyes, while I felt myself fading into the background again. Victoria arrived that evening in a tailored blazer and heels too high for our modest dining room. She carried herself like she was walking into a board meeting, not our family home. At 32, she was still an assistant marketing manager at a mid-sized firm in Dallas, but you would think she was running the company by the way she carried on. She dropped her purse on the chair, adjusted her hair, and announced her engagement to Trevor Lane with a dramatic flourish, showing off the modest diamond as if it were the crown jewels. My mother gasped and clutched her hands as though this was the pinnacle of achievement. She pulled Trevor into the kitchen, pressing food onto his plate, asking about his clients, praising his steady career in real estate. Victoria lapped it up, her chin tilted high, as she watched all of us marvel at her news. I waited for my turn for a chance to share something that mattered to me. When the table quieted, I said calmly that I had been promoted, my salary raised to $85,000 a year. I thought it was a milestone proof that years of late nights and endless campaigns at the agency were finally paying off. My mother did not even look at me. She waved her hand as though brushing away a gnat. "You are still single, Maddie. No one remembers a paycheck. People remember a family." The words landed like stones in my stomach. I pressed my fork into the meatloaf she had served, swallowing the bitterness with each bite. My father sipped, his whiskey eyes fixed on the news playing in the living room, offering neither praise nor criticism, just absence. Later that night, I stepped into the hallway to fetch more water, and stopped when I heard my mother and Victoria whispering in the kitchen. Their voices carried easily through the narrow walls. "We need to be careful about the seating," my mother said. "People will watch and they need to see who is at the center." "Exactly," Victoria replied. "Daniel and I should be front and center, Trevor too. Maddie can sit further back, somewhere unobtrusive." There was a small laugh. "Maybe near the kitchen," Victoria added. "She likes to help. She can fetch drinks if guests need more wine." The cruelty of it twisted in my chest. I stood frozen, gripping the glass so tight it nearly slipped from my hand. I wanted to storm in to shout that I was not some servant, that I had earned my place at any table. Instead, I backed away, the sting of their laughter following me down the hall. I sat on the edge of my old bed, the same one I had left years earlier, when I swore I would never let them define me. Anger coursed through me, burning against my ribs, but it tangled with something softer, the familiar ache of being unseen. The next morning at breakfast, I tried to speak, to address it. The coffee was hot and bitter in my hand as I told them plainly that I had overheard their conversation. Victoria arched her brow, a smirk tugging at her lips. "We were only joking, Maddie. Do not be so sensitive." I opened my mouth to argue, but my father lowered his newspaper, his eyes sharp. "Enough. Do not ruin the mood. This is your brother's celebration, not your stage." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted iron. My hands shook under the table hidden in my lap. The injustice of it threatened to spill out of me, but I swallowed it, pressing it down where all the other slights lived. My sister laughed lightly and leaned back in her chair, Trevor reaching to squeeze her hand, as if affirming that she was the star of the moment. The meal moved on without me. They discussed flower arrangements, photographers, the rehearsal dinner menu. I listened in silence, each word adding to the weight pressing against my chest. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in slow circles, the air heavy with Texas heat. I repeated my grandmother's words in my mind, the ones that had kept me steady through every dismissal. "Never let anyone decide your worth." I clenched my fists and whispered into the dark that I would not let them seat me in the shadows without consequence. In the ballroom tonight, as the music swirled and laughter filled the air, I felt the same pulse of anger I had carried from that dinner table. My mother and sister had planned this humiliation carefully, stitching it into the fabric of Daniel's wedding, so that I would sit hidden, diminished, erased. The doors to the kitchen banged open again, and the smell of garlic and butter rushed out. I straightened my shoulders. The memory of that conversation sharpened my mind, my father's voice echoing with finality. Do not ruin the mood. I sipped my water and held my phone tighter, waiting, knowing that I would not let them write me out of the story this time. I first met Nathaniel Brooks in New York, far from the weight of Austin and my family's judgments. It was a spring evening, the kind that wrapped the city in a soft glow, and I had forced myself to attend a gallery opening after work. I stood near a piece I barely understood, nursing a cheap glass of wine, when he struck up a conversation about the colors and how they reminded him of sunsets in Santa Fe. His voice was calm, curious without the condescension I had grown used to. We ended up talking for an hour, weaving from art to technology to the little quirks of the city that made us both smile. At first I had no idea who he was. He wore a simple navy suit and no tie, his hair a little tousled, his laugh easy. Only later did I learn he was the CEO of Innovate Tech, a company whose name I had seen in headlines but never connected to the man who asked me what my favorite novel was. When he admitted it casually, almost reluctantly, I was stunned. He brushed it off, saying titles were nothing compared to how a person treated others. We saw each other again, first at coffee shops, then dinners, and eventually weekends away when our schedules aligned. What struck me most was how little he cared about appearances. He asked about my work at Boyd Creative, a modest advertising agency that paid the bills, but rarely impressed anyone at family dinners. Instead of dismissing it, he leaned in, asked about campaigns I was proud of, even offered contacts who could help me sharpen my skills. He told me often that he admired how I fought for myself, how I never waited for someone else to hand me success. For the first time, I felt seen not for what I lacked, but for what I built. Nathaniel never tried to overshadow me. He made sure I understood that I had a voice worth hearing, even when mine trembled. He insisted that the life we shared was not about his billions or his company, but about the moments we carved out together. I remember sitting in his loft one night, the city lights spilling in through wide windows, when he looked at me and said softly that he wanted me to know I was enough without anyone's approval, including his. Yet fear lingered in me like a shadow. I had seen how my family reacted to any hint of my independence. If they ever knew about Nathaniel, about the kind of power and wealth he held, they would twist it into a weapon against me. They would call me opportunistic, accuse me of clinging to him because I could not stand on my own. I could already hear my mother's dismissive laugh, Victoria's sneer, the way my father would fold his arms and say I was living in a fantasy. So I kept our relationship private, tucked away, like a precious stone I could not risk exposing to the harshness of their light. There were moments I questioned if I was being unfair to him. When his colleagues invited me to events, and I declined, worried someone back home would see a photo online, he would squeeze my hand and tell me it was all right. When I apologized for holding back, he would kiss my forehead and remind me that we moved at our own pace, not anyone else's. Still, guilt sometimes pooled in me, mixing with the old ache of never being enough. One evening in Manhattan, after a dinner where we had talked about the future more openly than ever before, I admitted my fears to him. I told him about the years of favoritism, the way my mother and sister made me feel invisible, how even when I achieved something, it was brushed aside as if it were nothing. I confessed that I worried they would see him as a lifeline I clung to, not as the man I chose because he made me whole. He listened without interruption, his eyes steady on mine. When I finished, my voice cracking, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Maddie," he said slowly, "if they ever dare to humiliate you in front of others, I will be there to lift you up. I will not let them bury you again." The conviction in his voice settled into my bones. It was not the kind of promise made casually. It was the vow of a man who meant every word. Back in the ballroom now, the memory of that night wrapped around me like armor. The music and chatter faded as I thought of his face, the warmth of his hands, the certainty in his words. The phone in my lap buzzed again, a small vibration that cut through the noise around me. I knew it was him, and I knew he would come. I pressed my fingers around the device, breathing deeply. My mother's laughter rang out across the room, Victoria's voice sharp with triumph as she basked in the glow of guests who adored her. None of them knew what was coming, and for the first time that night, I felt the sting of humiliation soften, replaced by a quiet strength. I sat a little taller in that chair by the kitchen doors, the smell of food still drifting around me, the clang of trays still filling the air. I was not alone. Nathaniel's promise echoed through me steady and strong. I would not break, not this time. The doors opened once more, and servers hurried past, the hum of the crowd rising with the clinking of glasses. I kept my eyes forward, waiting, letting the steady rhythm of my breath guide me, knowing that the moment was shifting, and the vow he had spoken in that Manhattan restaurant was about to be tested in ways my family could never have imagined. The ballroom glimmered with golden light, every table set with towering centerpieces of white roses and crystal glassware that caught the glow of the chandeliers. Waiters moved in perfect rhythm trays, balanced high, their jackets pressed so sharply they seemed cut from glass. The music swelled as Daniel and his bride made their entrance, applause echoing against the vaulted ceilings. Cameras flashed in bursts, capturing every angle of their smiles. The local news crew positioned by the stage tilted their cameras, catching the details of the reception that would be replayed on evening broadcasts across Austin. There were more than 200 guests, each seated at immaculate tables near the front, each chair dressed in satin covers and tied with silver bows. The hum of conversation was filled with admiration, envy, and joy. I scanned the room from where I sat, my place so far from the stage, it might as well have been another building. My table was shoved against the swinging doors of the kitchen, the cloth draped carelessly, the light dim, as if someone had forgotten to check the bulbs. My chair did not match the others, a plain banquet seat scuffed at the legs, its cushion thin. The smell of garlic butter and detergent drifted over me every time a server pushed through the doors. When they did, the wood banged against the wall with a thud that made me flinch. Guests at the nearest tables glanced at me with half-concealed expressions. Some tilted their heads in pity, others smirked in quiet amusement. I felt their whispers thread through the air, tugging at me like invisible wires. My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as I tried to hold myself still. Victoria glided past in her fitted burgundy gown, her hair shimmering under the chandeliers. She leaned down, her lips brushing my ear, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "This is fitting, Maddie. Mom and I think this spot suits you best." I turned my head slightly, meeting her eyes. They sparkled with triumph. She straightened, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and floated back to her seat near the head table where Trevor sat beaming beside her. My mother joined them, her smile wide and radiant, as if nothing about what they had just done was cruel. I pressed my teeth together until my jaw ached. My fork trembled in my hand, and I set it down before anyone noticed. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, calling for attention. He introduced the bridal party, his voice booming, guests clapping, glasses raised in toasts. My father stood proudly near the stage, his arm looped around Daniel's shoulders, shaking hands with important colleagues who had come to witness the event. From where I sat, they were tiny figures blurred by distance and blocked by the constant rush of waiters moving between the doors. I shifted slightly, the chair creaking under my weight. My chest tightened with each burst of laughter drifting from the front. I wondered if anyone else noticed the cruelty of placing me here, or if they all accepted it as natural, as if my place had always been at the margins. The kitchen door slammed open again, a waiter nearly stumbling with a tray of champagne. The glasses clinked violently, liquid spilling over the rims. He muttered an apology and hurried past. A group of teenagers at a nearby table giggled, glancing at me as if I were part of the disruption. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I reached for my water glass, nearly empty now, and swallowed the last sip as though it could wash away the bitterness. My dress suddenly felt too tight, the fabric clinging to my skin in a suffocating embrace. I lowered my head and breathed deeply. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The music softened, shifting to a ballad, and Daniel led his bride to the dance floor. They moved with practiced grace, her gown sweeping behind her, his hand firm on her back. Guests circled the floor with phones raised, recording every step. The applause was thunderous when the dance ended, the crowd clapping in unison, cheers filling the air. I clapped too, my palms meeting each other mechanically, but my eyes blurred with tears I refused to shed. I was his sister, and yet my seat was closer to the staff than to the family. My phone buzzed against the table, the sound vibrating in my chest like a drumbeat. I snatched it up quickly, shielding the screen from wandering eyes. The message was short, only 3 words, but it pierced through the fog of humiliation with clarity. I am coming. My throat tightened, breath catching as I stared at the words. The noise of the ballroom receded, the laughter and music becoming distant. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing the phone against my palm, letting the message steady me. When I opened them again, I caught Victoria watching me from across the room, her smile thin and knowing. She thought she had won. She thought I would sit here all night, diminished, erased. But I knew better. My lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, one she could not understand. The kitchen door slammed once more, the smell of onions rushing over me, but I hardly noticed. My heart was beating differently now, faster, steadier, alive with the knowledge that the tide was about to turn. The glow from my phone dimmed as I set it back down, my pulse still racing. I leaned against the edge of the table, trying to ground myself while the music thundered on. My thoughts drifted somewhere else, away from the ballroom. Back to the day Clara Mitchell, my oldest friend, and now a lawyer in Dallas, sat across from me with a stack of papers and a look of concern. It had been only weeks after my grandmother Rose passed, and grief still clung to me like a second skin. Clara had insisted we meet in her office, the smell of coffee and paper heavy in the air. She explained the details carefully, her voice calm but edged with warning. Grandma had left me $15,000 and a handwritten letter folded neatly in the will. It was not much compared to what others received, but to me it carried a weight beyond the number. The letter was in her familiar script, reminding me that no one could take away the worth I carried inside. Clara's eyes had narrowed as she tapped her pen against the desk. "Maddie, you need to be careful. Your mother and sister may try to challenge this. They may argue that you do not deserve even this share." I remember the way the words sank like stones in my stomach. "They would not," I whispered, though even as I said it, I felt the doubt. Clara tilted her head, her tone sharp with the realism of someone who had seen families torn apart over less. "You know they could. Favoritism has always been clear in your house. In the eyes of the court, their arguments might carry weight if they frame you as detached or undeserving. You need to be prepared." That night I read my grandmother's letter over and over, her words etched in my mind. "Never let anyone cut your wings, Maddie. Promise me you will keep flying." Each time I read it, I felt both comfort and fear, because I knew Clara was right. In a family where affection was conditional, even an inheritance could be weaponized. Now, as I sat by the kitchen doors of Daniel's grand wedding, the humiliation of being shoved into this seat mingled with that old dread. It was never just about love with them. It was about power, appearances, control. The 15,000 was a symbol not of wealth, but of my grandmother's faith in me. And I knew if they could, they would try to erase even that. The clatter of dishes behind the doors jolted me. A server brushed past with a tray, and I caught a few words of conversation from nearby guests. They spoke of Daniel's new house in Westlake, of Victoria's upcoming engagement party. Their words reminded me of everything my family prized, the same things my grandmother had warned me not to measure myself by. I whispered under my breath, the words trembling out of me before I could stop them. If she were alive, she would never let me sit here. My fingers traced the edge of the tablecloth, rough and uneven, a far cry from the pristine linens up front. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the image of her garden wash over me, the smell of roses and soil, the warmth of her hands. She would have marched into this ballroom, her back straight, her voice steady, and pulled me to the front. She would not have let them reduce me to the shadows. Clara's warning echoed again. "Be prepared. Families like yours do not forgive. They erase." I opened my eyes and looked around at the crowd, at the glittering dresses and polished shoes, at the way my mother's laughter rang out above the music, at how Victoria's head tilted with smugness as she whispered into Trevor's ear. They believed they were untouchable, that I would always take the seat handed to me. But I knew differently. Nathaniel was already on his way, and with him came the reminder that I had choices, that I was not powerless. And even beyond him, I carried the strength of the words my grandmother left me. Words no court, no mother, no sister could erase. A server leaned down to place a basket of rolls on my table, his eyes flicking to me briefly with sympathy, before he disappeared again, into the blur of the celebration. I pulled one apart slowly, my appetite gone, my thoughts circling back to the letter, folded in my dresser drawer at home. I imagined the ink strokes her steady hand, the way she underlined the word, courage. The music swelled again, as speeches began at the head table. Glasses clinked, voices cheered. I sat back, the noise distant, my mind fixed on the weight of all that had been said to me in Clara's office, on the knowledge that love and legacy could both be stripped away if I did not guard them. I let out a slow breath, my voice barely audible, as I spoke into the din, words meant only for me and for the memory of her. If she were here, I would not be in this chair. The kitchen door opened again, flooding me with heat and noise, but I did not move. I kept my eyes forward, holding on to the thought like a shield, knowing it would carry me through the rest of this night. The MC called for silence, his voice booming through the microphone as he invited the best man to the stage. Applause rippled across the room, glasses lifted, and laughter spilled over the music. I sat still, my back stiff, forcing myself to endure the spectacle in front of me. Then a shift happened. The air itself seemed to change, a subtle tightening that made people glance toward the entrance. A murmur spread low at first, then louder swelling until it broke into words. Guests were whispering to each other, their faces turned toward the tall figure stepping through the doors. That is Brooks. Nathaniel Brooks. Is he really here? The hum of recognition washed over the crowd like a tide. Phones were discreetly raised, cameras snapped, and the music faltered for just a moment as the pianist caught sight of him. He wore a perfectly cut black suit, no tie, his posture easy, his presence commanding without effort. He did not smile, not yet. His eyes scanned the room until they found me tucked away near the kitchen, and in that moment, every nerve in my body lit with relief. Nathaniel walked with steady purpose, his shoes echoing against the marble floor, the crowd parting instinctively as he moved. Guests leaned to whisper, some wide-eyed, others curious, and even the waiters slowed as they passed. The spotlight that had bathed Daniel and his bride only minutes ago now seemed to shift, pulled toward Nathaniel's approach. I could feel my mother stiffen from across the room. Her laughter faltered, her hand tightening on her glass. Victoria's smirk wavered as her eyes darted between me and the man striding toward my table. Trevor shifted in his chair, clearly unsettled, tugging at his cufflinks as if they might anchor him. Nathaniel stopped at the edge of my table. Without hesitation, he placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me, reminding me I was not alone. His voice was low but carried across the room with absolute clarity. "You do not belong here, Maddie. You do not need to sit in this spot." The whispers surged louder, a current of shock and speculation. Elaine rose halfway from her chair, her face pale, her words fumbling as she tried to regain control. "We do not know you, sir. Who exactly are you?" Nathaniel turned his gaze toward her, calm and unwavering. "I am Madeline's partner, and I will not stand by while she is treated like this, hidden away by the kitchen, as though she is an embarrassment." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the music had stopped, the pianist's fingers frozen above the keys. Daniel's bride stared, confusion flickering across her face as she clutched his arm. My brother looked away, shame written across his expression, though he said nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Victoria gave a sharp laugh, brittle and forced as if she could slice through the tension. "Well, that is dramatic. Maddie always did have a flair for theatrics." Her voice trembled at the edges, betraying her. Guests did not laugh with her. Instead, their eyes followed me, measuring, reevaluating, as though they finally saw the cruelty of what had been done. Nathaniel's hand squeezed gently, urging me to rise. My legs shook, but not from fear. Something steadier was pushing through me now, something that felt like vindication. I pushed back my chair, the scrape of the metal legs against the tile loud in the sudden silence. I stood smoothing my dress with trembling hands and lifted my chin. For the first time that night, I looked directly at the crowd, at my family, at every person who had glanced at me with pity or disdain. The chair remained behind me, tucked against the wall, a symbol of everything I had been forced to accept. I stepped forward, leaving it there, the kitchen doors swinging once more as if to punctuate the moment. Nathaniel shifted beside me, his presence like a shield, but it was my choice to move, my choice to stand. The whispers grew again louder now, rippling across the ballroom as I turned away from that forgotten corner, leaving the chair abandoned in the shadows. The silence cracked open with the sound of heels against marble. Mine. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also strangely freeing, as though I was leaving behind years of being shoved aside. Nathaniel kept pace beside me, tall and certain, the crowd shifting instinctively to make room. Heads turned, whispers collided, and the glare of phone screens multiplied as guests scrambled to capture what was happening. I heard the faint click of video cameras starting, the subtle hum of record buttons pressed. Somewhere near the head table, a woman gasped. Daniel's bride clutched his arm, her smile, frozen eyes wide. My brother looked down at the floor, his jaw tight, while my father pressed his lips together in rigid silence. Trevor remained seated, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself. His face was pale, his eyes darting between me and Victoria, unsure which way to lean. Victoria, however, leapt to her feet, her voice slicing through the murmur like broken glass. "You will regret this, Madeline." Her words cracked shrill and furious. She wanted to wound me, to remind me of my place, but the venom only made the guests recoil. I caught the look on one woman's face, disgust flickering in her eyes as she recorded the outburst on her phone. Others shook their heads, whispers turning sharper, questions spilling into the air. I did not slow. My hand brushed against Nathaniel's arm, steadying myself as we reached the center of the ballroom. The chandeliers glittered above, throwing shards of light across us like a spotlight. He reached for my hand, entwining his fingers with mine, lifting them just enough that everyone could see. His calm contrasted with the storm rising behind us, and in that calm, I found my strength. The crowd parted near the doors, and I heard the shuffle of reporters from the local news station who had been covering the wedding. Cameras were raised, lenses adjusted. The sudden chorus of shutters and flashes lit the room in pulses of white. My face burned with their attention, but for once it was not humiliation I felt. It was clarity. I could hear my mother's voice calling my name, soft at first, then louder, strained. "Maddie, wait. We can talk about this." Her tone cracked under the weight of desperation. I did not turn. Guests leaned across tables, murmuring to one another. Words drifted past me like smoke. "That's Brooks, isn't it? Innovate Tech. I cannot believe he is here. She is with him." The disbelief laced with awe. We reached the doors, the hum of conversation surging behind us. A few guests hurried forward, phones raised high, filming every step. The air outside was cooler, the night settling over Austin, with the hum of traffic in the distance. The valet line was crowded, attendants rushing to bring cars forward. But one vehicle already waited at the curb. A black limousine, sleek and gleaming headlights casting long beams across the pavement. The cameras followed. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment as Nathaniel opened the door with a practiced ease. He held it for me, his hand steady, his eyes fixed on mine. I hesitated just long enough to look back over my shoulder. Through the glass doors I could see Victoria, restrained by Trevor, her mouth still moving furiously, though her words no longer carried across the distance. My mother sat stunned, her hand pressed to her chest, her composure cracking in front of a room full of witnesses. My father remained rigid, his arms crossed, his face hard as stone, but I saw the flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. The flashes intensified as I stepped forward. My hand tightened around Nathaniel's, the two of us framed by the burst of light. I lifted my chin, shoulders straight, and climbed into the limousine. The sound of shutters followed me, capturing the instant forever. Inside, the leather smelled of cedar and new polish. The door closed softly, shutting out the noise for a moment, leaving only the muffled hum of voices outside. I exhaled, my chest rising and falling, as though I had been holding my breath for years. Nathaniel slid in after me, the door sealing shut. For a moment, we sat in silence, the world outside still buzzing, the cameras flashing through tinted glass. He reached for my hand again, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. "You are not invisible anymore, Maddie," he said quietly. The car eased forward, the night swallowing the sound of the ballroom behind us, but the image of the abandoned chair by the kitchen doors lingered in my mind. A symbol left behind, captured now in the lenses of every camera, pointed our way. The limousine moved swiftly through the streets, the city lights streaking past the windows, and before I could fully process what had just unfolded, we were pulling onto the private airstrip on the outskirts of Austin. The sleek jet waited with its lights glowing like beacons in the dark, the engines humming low and steady. Nathaniel's hand rested gently on mine as the car stopped. He opened the door before the driver could and guided me out the night air, warm against my skin. I climbed the steps into the cabin, my heels clicking softly against polished metal. Inside, the jet was quiet, the air cool and scented faintly with leather and cedar. I lowered myself into a cream seat that molded around me, still half stunned by the speed of everything. Moments ago, I had been sitting by a kitchen door. Now I was in a world so far removed, it felt like stepping into a dream. The flight attendant welcomed us and offered champagne, but I shook my head, my stomach tight. Nathaniel accepted only water, always attuned to the moments when I needed calm rather than celebration. As the jet lifted into the sky, the pressure eased from my shoulders, Austin falling away beneath the clouds. Hours later, we descended toward Hawaii, the black expanse of the Pacific glimmering below the horizon, painted with the faintest line of dawn. When the wheels touched the runway, I felt a shiver of disbelief. I had not even had time to pack yet. Here I was stepping into another world, while my family remained tangled in the wreckage they had created. The drive to the resort was lined with palms, swaying in the early breeze, the scent of salt heavy in the air. The property rose before us like something carved out of paradise lanterns, lighting the pathways, the sound of waves rolling endlessly beyond. Nathaniel led me through marble halls to a suite overlooking the ocean, its wide doors thrown open to let the night air in. I walked onto the balcony and gripped the railing, staring at the endless water stretching to the horizon. By evening, we sat at a table placed directly on the sand, candles flickering in the breeze, the surf whispering only feet away. My dress brushed the warm grains, my bare feet curling into them, as the servers laid out plates of seared fish, tropical fruit, and wine, chilled in crystal glasses. The moon hung high, silvering the waves. Nathaniel raised his glass slightly. "To you." The words caught me off guard. My throat tightened and I forced a small smile. "You should not toast to me." "Why not?" he asked, his eyes steady. "Because without you, they would still treat me like garbage." I lowered my gaze to the table, shame crawling up my spine. "That is all they see. Without you standing there, I would have been left by those doors all night invisible." The sound of the surf filled the silence between us. I kept my hands in my lap, twisting my fingers until he reached across and stilled them. "Maddie, look at me." I lifted my eyes reluctantly. His face was calm, but his voice carried weight. "You stood up. You left that chair. I did not pull you out of it. I opened a door, yes, but you walked through. That was you, not me." My lips trembled. "If you had not come, they would still think I was nothing. They will always think what they want," he said softly. "But the truth is, they saw you stand. They saw you refuse to play the part they wrote for you. That was your choice, your courage." Tears welled before I could stop them. I pressed my napkin to my face, but they slipped through hot against my cheeks. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the memory of rising from that chair burned too vividly. He was right. The act had been mine. The waves broke louder as though the ocean itself was answering. I set the napkin down, my hands shaking my chest, loosening as the sobs turned softer. These were not the tears of humiliation I had cried for years in silence. These were different. They were release. Nathaniel leaned closer, his thumb brushing gently across my cheek. "Let them call you what they want. You know who you are now. And I am here not to make you, but to walk beside you." I exhaled sharply, the last of the tension breaking. For the first time in years, the weight I carried seemed to lift, replaced with something lighter, freer. The sound of my own crying faded into the rhythm of the waves. I rested my head against his shoulder, the candles flickering lower, As the night stretched on, the stars wheeled above us bright and endless, and the ocean breathed against the shore, as if keeping time with my heart. Morning sunlight spilled into the suite, soft and golden, warming the sheets tangled around me. I sat up slowly, listening to the distant crash of waves and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. Nathaniel was already awake, seated on the balcony with a cup of coffee in hand, his laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting on his face. I wrapped the robe around me and stepped outside. He looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You should see this," he said, turning the laptop toward me. Headlines filled the screen, each more shocking than the last. Social media posts with millions of views, video clips replayed over and over. The footage showed me rising from that chair by the kitchen doors, Nathaniel appearing at my side, our hands joining the gasp of the crowd echoing in the background. Captions read, "Family humiliates daughter at brother's wedding. Billionaire intervenes." I felt my stomach twist as I scrolled, reading comments pouring beneath the videos. People were outraged, calling my mother and sister cruel strangers, defending me with words they could never know I needed. Some compared the chair by the kitchen to punishment. Others wrote that no daughter should ever be treated as less in her own family. By mid-morning, national outlets had picked up the story. A reporter from Houston stood outside the Austin hotel where the wedding had been held, describing the moment like it was breaking news. Guests had been interviewed, their faces blurred, confirming what had happened, their voices hushed but unmistakable. One woman said, "It was deliberate. They put her there on purpose." My phone buzzed against the nightstand, the screen lighting with Clara's name. I answered quickly, her voice spilling through in a rush. "Maddie, have you seen it yet? The video is everywhere." I nodded, though she could not see me. "Yes," I said softly. "I have." "This is important," she pressed. "If your mother or sister ever try to challenge the will, this video is evidence. It shows a pattern: public humiliation, favoritism so obvious that no judge could ignore it." She paused, her voice lowering. "You are stronger than you think, Maddie. And now the world has seen what you have lived." Her words landed with weight. For so long my experiences had been private wounds, invisible scars. Now they were on screens across the country, undeniable, documented. As the day unfolded, Nathaniel and I remained by the water, trying to carve a small pocket of peace while the storm raged online. But there was no escaping it. News anchors debated the story, psychologists weighed in about family dynamics, even comedians joked about it in late-night segments. I should have felt exposed, but instead, there was a strange sense of justice. People who had never met me understood, and for once my family's cruelty was not hidden behind closed doors. Back in Austin, my mother's phone must have been ringing without pause. Friends, colleagues, church members, all demanding answers. Victoria's social media accounts locked down after floods of comments accused her of jealousy and spite. Trevor was photographed leaving their apartment, his head lowered, refusing to answer questions. By evening, Clara called again. "I have confirmed through a colleague that your mother has been receiving dozens of messages from people she knows. Their reputation is unraveling, Maddie. It is not just embarrassment, it is social collapse." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the pillows, listening to the surf outside. A part of me ached, not from guilt, but from the realization of how fragile their pride had always been. One night, one video, and everything they built on appearances was shattering. Nathaniel sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders, grounding me. "Let them face it," he murmured. "This is not your burden." Still, I imagined my mother pacing the living room, her hands trembling as calls came in. I pictured Victoria scrolling furiously through comments, trying to delete them, her face red with rage and humiliation. I thought of my father sitting in silence, staring at the floor, too proud to admit that the image of perfection had cracked beyond repair. The resort staff brought dinner to the balcony, candles flickering in the breeze, the sound of laughter from other guests drifting across the gardens. I picked at the food absent-mindedly, my thoughts still in Texas. Nathaniel refilled my glass with water and said gently, "You can breathe now. You do not have to fight every moment." But even as I nodded, I felt the shift deep in my chest. Something irreversible had happened. The humiliation they planned for me had turned back on them, and it was no longer just family conflict. It was public, viral, permanent. My phone lit up again. Another message from Clara. She did not need to say much. One sentence was enough to draw the night's curtain. "They are drowning in calls, Maddie. Their name is in ruins." I set the phone aside and listened to the ocean. The crash of waves louder now, steady, relentless, like justice rolling in from the horizon. The courthouse in downtown Austin smelled faintly of paper and dust, a place where secrets were laid bare under fluorescent light. A month had passed since the wedding, and though the headlines had faded, the tension in my chest returned the moment I stepped into the wood-paneled room where Clara had arranged the reading of my grandmother's revised will. Nathaniel walked beside me, his presence steady, but this was a battle I had to face myself. My mother Elaine sat at the long table, her pearl necklace a little too tight against her throat. Her smile stretched thin as though she could charm her way past the damage already done. Victoria crossed her legs sharply, her heel tapping against the floor arms folded in defiance. Daniel sat apart from them, hunched in his chair, eyes fixed on the tabletop, as if ashamed to even look at me. Clara shuffled the papers, her tone crisp, the voice of both my friend and my advocate. "Thank you all for coming. We are here to go over the final provisions of Rose Peterson's estate." I straightened in my seat, folding my hands on the table. My heart pounded, but I kept my face calm. Elaine leaned forward, her voice syrupy. "Maddie, we should put aside the unpleasantness from the wedding. Family is family. We are here to do this together." Her words landed heavy with insincerity. Victoria added quickly, tilting her chin. "Yes, whatever differences we have had, Grandma would want us united." I felt Nathaniel tense slightly beside me, but I did not need him to speak. Their sudden sweetness was nothing but hunger disguised as peace. Clara cleared her throat and began. "Rose left specific gifts to each of her grandchildren. Madeline, you were left a sum of $15,000, as well as a personal letter which you already received." Victoria's lips curled into a smirk, as though she found the number laughable. My mother exhaled in relief, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. But Clara continued. "In addition, there was an amendment made shortly before her passing. Rose left Madeline full ownership of a small house in Round Rock. It is modest, but in excellent condition, with the deed signed and notarized." Silence cut through the room. My mother's smile vanished, her mouth parting, as if the air had been stolen from her. Victoria's heel stopped tapping, her eyes flashing wide before narrowing into sharp points. Daniel raised his head, his lips pressed tight, then lowered his gaze again. "That is impossible," Elaine said quickly, her voice too loud in the quiet room. Mother would not do that. She knew the family needed unity, not division. Clara remained calm, sliding the signed amendment across the table. "It is all here." She made the decision herself. Victoria slammed her palm against the wood, rattling the water glasses. "This is ridiculous. Maddie does not even live here anymore. She abandoned this family years ago." Clara leaned forward slightly, her lawyer's edge gleaming. "If you intend to contest, you should know that the video from Daniel's wedding has been entered into the record. It demonstrates a pattern of favoritism and humiliation directed at Madeline. In court, that would support the validity of Rose's decision to protect her." The blood drained from Victoria's face. My mother's eyes flicked nervously, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Nathaniel's hand brushed mine under the table, but I kept my gaze steady on them. I let the silence stretch long enough to make them squirm. Finally, I spoke, my voice low but sharp. "That chair you gave me at the wedding, tucked by the kitchen, meant to shame me, has become evidence. It is the reason no one will ever be able to take this from me." Elaine opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Victoria looked away, her nails digging into her arm. Daniel whispered something under his breath, too soft to hear, but his shame was clear. I rose slowly from my chair, sliding the papers toward me, the sound of the pages scratching across the wood. My legs were steady, my spine straight. I looked at each of them in turn, letting them feel the weight of my gaze. The chair at the wedding had been their weapon, but now it was mine. Clara gathered her files, her tone final. Unless there are any further questions, this concludes the reading. No one spoke. The room was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the faint buzz of the lights overhead. I walked toward the door, the heels of my shoes striking against the tile. Behind me, the family that had tried to diminish me sat crumbling under the truth. Their pride fractured their names, smeared their inheritance slipping from their hands. Ahead of me, the hallway stretched long and open, filled with light from tall windows, a reminder that I had stepped out from their shadows for good. The ocean stretched out before me, endless and glittering, as the yacht cut smoothly through the water. The sun dipped low toward the horizon, casting everything in gold, the kind of light that softened edges and made even pain feel distant. I leaned against the railing, the breeze lifting strands of my hair, the salt air stinging my lips, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing me down. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with the captain, his laugh carried by the wind, warm and sure. I watched him for a moment, grateful, but also aware that what steadied me now was not only him. It was me. It was the girl who had once sat on the edge of a bed in Austin, swearing she would leave, who had endured years of being told she was less, who had been shoved into the shadows, and finally chosen to step into the light. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the waves carry me back to the ballroom, to that chair by the kitchen doors. They had thought it would shrink me. They had thought it would humiliate me into silence, but it had done the opposite. In front of 200 people, in front of cameras and whispers and flashing lights, I had risen. And when Nathaniel took my hand, it was not rescue. It was recognition. Somewhere back in Austin, my family was still facing the fallout. Their friends no longer answered calls. The neighbors whispered when they passed. Invitations that once came easily had dried up. Their name, once a source of pride, now hung like a stain. Elaine had always cared more about appearances than truth, and now appearances were all she had left crumbling under scrutiny. Victoria could not delete the comments fast enough, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. Daniel had disappeared from public view, unable to reconcile his silence that night with the image of a protective brother he wished he had been. I thought of them sometimes, not with longing, but with clarity. They had chosen to make me small. They had chosen to strip me of dignity in front of strangers. And in doing so, they had revealed themselves. They had not destroyed me. They had destroyed their own illusions. Nathaniel came to stand beside me, his hand brushing mine on the railing. The water sparkled in his eyes, reflecting both strength and gentleness. We stood in silence, watching the horizon together, letting the yacht glide steadily forward. I breathed deeply, my chest no longer tight, my pulse no longer racing. They tried to lower me that night, I whispered almost to myself, but all they did was humiliate themselves. Nathaniel's hand tightened around mine, no words needed. The truth of it already lived in both of us. The waves broke louder against the hull, a rhythm steady and certain, and I thought of all the chairs I had been forced into over the years. The small seats in classrooms where my achievements went unnoticed, the corners of family dinners where my words were dismissed, the chair by the kitchen doors at the wedding, the final insult. All of them behind me now. I turned my gaze out over the water, the horizon wide and unbroken, and I knew at last that I had claimed a place they could never touch. I did not need their approval. I did not need their pride. I had chosen my own seat, one built not on permission, but on truth. I do not need a chair at their table, I thought, my voice steady in the wind. I choose my own chair in freedom and happiness, and in the arms of someone who truly values me. The yacht pressed onward into the evening, the sky deepening with streaks of pink and violet, the sea stretching forever ahead. I let the moment settle into me, a quiet closure, a reminder that the story they tried to write for me was over. This was mine now. If you have ever been made to feel small, if you have ever been dismissed or pushed aside, share your story. Because sometimes the moment that was meant to break you is only the beginning of your true strength.